Welcome to ALD Stories, a series chronicling the personal journeys of the people behind atomic layer deposition, untold stories of the technology, and deep dives into the history, development, and future of ALD. I'm your host, Tyler Myers, bringing you this podcast from Benek, the home of ALD. Hey listeners, welcome to another episode of ALD Stories. Episode 26 is a real treat as we are joined by none other than Professor Stacey Bent. Stacey is a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at Stanford and currently serves as the Vice Provost of Graduate Education and Postdoctoral Affairs. Her work at Stanford focuses on understanding and controlling surface and interfacial chemistry and applying this knowledge in fields like semiconductor processing, nanotechnology, and sustainable energy. Awarded the ALD Innovator Award in 2021, atomic layer deposition is a staple in Stacey's group, being used both as a tool for applied science and a subject for fundamental research. In this episode, Stacey and I discuss all aspects of her career, including early area selective deposition work that has informed her group's current ASD focus, how her different academic appointments in chemistry and engineering have influenced the direction of her work, and how ALD can be used in energy applications. We also chat about how Stacey finds the best paths for her students, how being a professor and vice provost feed back to each other, and new programs she's initiated in her vice provost position. I really could not be happier to host such a wonderful and influential scientist in our field. I cannot thank Stacey enough for taking the time from her busy schedule to join the program. So please, grab your tea or coffee and enjoy Stanford's Stacey Bent. All right. Well, Stacey, welcome to the ALD Stories podcast. It's really so great to have you on. I think I've been trying for maybe 2 years to get onto your schedule, so it's really super exciting that we finally get to have this conversation. So many welcomes to you, Stacey. Happy to have you.
Thank you, Tyler, and thanks for your patience in scheduling this.
So I think people who have listened to the show a few times already probably have an understanding of how this typically goes. So we'll start the same way that I typically start, and that's with a little bit of background and how you found yourself into the field of ALD. I know that you have had a lot of background in surface science, and it seems like that was a common thread for you throughout all of your studies. So how that evolved and into this technique, I'm sure, is an interesting path. So I will let you take it away, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, it was surface chemistry that brought me to atomic layer deposition. So I do think of myself as a surface scientist, and we're always really interested in interfaces and surfaces and how to manipulate them. And it was that interest and ability to modify surfaces that got us involved, so my group and I and colleagues in the atomic layer deposition area. And it was really for the application now about 20 years ago for area selective atomic layer deposition. And it was the thinking that I hadn't been doing ALD at the time, but was going to team up with a colleague of mine, Paul McIntyre, with conversations from another colleague who's another surface chemist, Chris Chidsey. We started thinking about potential projects where we could manipulate the surface chemistry to do directed ALD. So Paul McIntyre already was doing ALD. My group was doing surface chemistry, and that's actually what got us started is, doing chemistry at a surface on one type of material versus another to then bring these to an ALD reactor and get deposition on one type of material versus another. And that's the basis of area selective ALD. And so actually that is what started us in ALD, and it's since grown to, kind of permeate most of the research projects in my group. We don't only work on area selective ALD, but it was really through our surface chemistry interest that we got involved in ALD.
That is really interesting. I'm actually a little bit surprised to hear that it was area selective that originally got you into it. Yes, I think maybe many people, including myself, who are maybe, only the last 10 years in the field or something like this, maybe only think of area selective as the hot ALD area now, and not something that was maybe being thought too much ahead of time.
Those were early days of area selective ALD, and there was a lull in it for a number of years after that earlier work, and then it's become very popular, and my group has also really picked up our efforts in it as well.
What year was this about that you started to get into?
We're in the sort of mid 2000s. So I think 2004 type of time period.
Okay, and what was the area selective landscape like at that time? I'm sure there were maybe that many people working on it, but were were the strategies kind of still the same as they are now today?
Yes, certainly they were pretty similar. I mean, our strategy that we, jumped into was we hadn't started thinking we were going to do it this way, but we quickly found that self-assembled monolayers were a good way to control surface growth, so basically to block growth. But the back in those early days, the application we were looking at was for high-K gate stacks for transistors. So we really were trying to do selective ALD of hafnium oxide on a gate stack. And if you look at some of our earlier work, that actually was the structure we were looking at. We were basically growing on silicon and not on neighboring oxides. So we were not the first to do it, but we were very early and developed a lot of the kind of thinking around it together with colleagues at the time. And those strategies really are still in use today.
Interesting. So, what was kind of the reason that this lull, this dip in interest kind of happened? So, was it just not time yet for area selective? Were the majority of the applications or the industry not ready to adopt something like this quite yet?
I think that's right. Yeah, at the time there was it wasn't at the point we are today, where I think there's a much more strong need for these selective deposition methods. There it was, it would be nice. Actually, our original motivation was as part of an environmentally benign semiconductor manufacturing center. I know that's a mouthful, but it is basically we were trying to minimize the use of chemicals in depositing and, minimize what we put down on a device. So I don't think that that's really the best motivation for it anymore, but at the time, that's what got us started. And then more recently, as feature sizes have gotten smaller and also much more into the 3 dimensions, there's a realization that a lot of the standard processing isn't going to be ideal. And so there's much more need for it. But at the time, it was a little bit far off in the future.
Or a time where fundamentals have not quite caught up to, or I guess the applications have not quite caught up to the fundamentals quite yet.
The need hadn't caught up, and the ability wasn't there either. I mean, those were sort of early days, and even now, I think in that field, there's a long ways to go to really get to where this, the levels of selectivity and diversity of materials that people would like to have.
Sure. So you mentioned that you were using SAMs, so small molecule inhibitor type of approaches. Is that still something that you're doing today in your lab?
Yeah, we were actually, I wouldn't consider a SAM a small molecule inhibitor. I mean, they're still small. They're not like proteins, but they are, on the order of about 20 angstroms long. And so those are one approach for inhibiting surfaces that we still very much use today. They're quite effective, even though I think there's an interest in trying other types of molecules. So the small molecule inhibitors or even no inhibitor, really just relying on inherent chemical selectivity and tuning other process parameters. But those SAMs are still quite effective, and that is one of our strategies that we still use today.
Hey, fantastic. I have a couple questions about SAMs. I'm actually not super familiar with or I guess too deep familiar with area selective stuff. I didn't work on it too much, so I have my cursory knowledge of reading some papers, but maybe some people who know a bit about device fabrication might wonder about having these kinds of organic molecules in the device, for instance. So are there any challenges with having this kind of, maybe a carbon-hydrogen chain or something like this on the surface of a device? Is it any different than the polymers, for instance, that were used for lithography masks, or does it not matter that you are having some organic molecules in there?
I think, just like you said, there are organic molecules used in various steps of device fabrication, so it's not completely foreign. That said, there certainly over the years has been pushback and concern about using these somewhat less known SAMs or self-assembled monolayers in the process. One, because of the thought that they might need to be, it might need to be a liquid phase process for putting them on the surface, but that actually isn't the case. Many of the SAMs you can put down in vapor phase quite effectively. And then the other is, you're introducing some big molecule. Are you going to be able to get rid of all that carbon? And there are ways to remove the SAMs as well. So despite, the other one is the time. So to form a really good resistive layer, our early studies showed that it can take hours, many hours, to form the kind of self-assembled monolayer that really resisted deposition at the level you needed for high selectivities. And so, of course, nobody's going to want to add that much time to the device fabrication because it impacts throughput and, of course, cost. But we, over time, I think the time frame of being able to get that inhibitory layer has been reduced depending on the kind of SAM. So I think despite the concern that still, you hear people say, boy, wish we really didn't have to use those, would love to not use SAMs. I think there's an acceptance that, well, SAMs work, so let's just try to go with them for now until something else better comes along.
Yeah, I suppose if it works and it's good enough, then let it be, I suppose. But yeah, the time question was actually going to be my next one, like how long it would take to actually form a good monolayer. So at least the one thing I knew about SAMs is that the time that it takes to go from the kind of like laying down phase for them to actually assemble into the upright monolayer can vary quite a bit. You said even to hours, which I imagine is not ideal for fabrication.
Yeah, we published some studies. This was work done by a graduate student in my group at the time, Rong Chen, who also continues to do some really nice ALD work in the field. But at the time, she had done a study showing that to get a really pristine SAM, it took 48 hours. Okay, so that would give anybody pause. That was one type of SAM. Those are basically siloxane bonds to a silicon oxide type surface. Other SAMs can form much more quickly. We have other ones like, for example, thiols, alkane thiols delivered in the vapor phase, which bond really well to metal surfaces and therefore block growth on metals. Those you can do in a matter of seconds. So there are definitely different approaches to this. And also the 48 hours was sort of the very fundamental study, ideal best SAM. If you have ways of having a sort of a so-so blocking layer, but you have methods to kind of correct for it, which my group and others have looked at. So you have cyclical processes that might remove where you get a little bit of growth. Then you don't need to go to those really long times to form the most perfect layers you can.
Sure. Some people with a little bit of very selective knowledge know that, yeah, even just a difference in growth rate is enough to call it selective, right? So if one's growing slow, one's growing fast. So I assume then, yeah, if you have SAMs that are partially inhibiting, yes, if you have an etch-back method or something like that, it would work as well.
Yes, right. Etch-back works. And also, if you're only putting down a nanometer, a few cycles, then you can get away with much poorer blocking than if you're trying to do many nanometers of growth of something that's a really reactive precursor.
So what's particular applications is your lab going towards with the area selective deposition right now? Or is it mostly just fundamental work?
We still really focus on, fundamentals and building up a fundamental understanding as well as toolkit of materials and processes that can block, material A over material B. So, dielectric on dielectric, dielectric on metal, metal on metal, metal on dielectric. So we try to look at, and beyond that, so, growth in carbon and not dielectric. One of the big applications that I think people are interested in industry right now is for back-end processing, so self-aligned via processes. But there are others too. I think what I'm often told is what we want is a library of selective processes, and we have all kinds of places we can put them and use them if we have a good process to work. So we really focus, and I've encouraged my group over the years to focus much more on, really just laying the groundwork of understanding. Now, that said, we work a lot with industry and really try to understand what the needs are, and we've worked with amazing collaborators in various companies over the years, which help us understand like what the needs are. But our real contribution, I think, is generally focused on kind of a fundamental understanding and new processes that can be used more widely than what we do in our own group.
That's really great. I've said a few times, I think, on this podcast that ALD in itself, I found, or in my opinion, was developed a little bit backwards from from a very application-driven point of view, and now we're still figuring out a ton of fundamentals about how ALD works. And I always wonder, okay, if there had been at the same time as Tuomo when they were developing ALD or ALE back then, if there was another lab doing a lot of very, very fundamental work at the time, if it would have progressed a lot more rapidly. So I anticipate now, with so many people working around area selective deposition, having labs like yours where you're putting a lot of the foundation down, and others that are thinking very heavily on the application side, that will kind of be a nice marriage of efficiency in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I had a question about your lab in general, or maybe this is more a bit about your background. Maybe we can kind of move back to the work that's happening in your lab. So we're talking a lot about work that kind of is fundamental around ALD, but your lab also does a lot of application-driven things, particularly in the kind of energy sector. And I was curious how your background has kind of influenced this, I say, makeup of research projects, that you have such a nice balance and mix of fundamental and applied science.
Well, my own background is kind of a mix of those. I have degrees in both chemistry and chemical engineering, and I've taught in both chemistry and chemical engineering departments. Currently in a chemical engineering department, and also a department of energy science and engineering. So I think I am motivated by both things. I have a sort of internal fascination for science and scientific questions, but I'm also highly motivated by solving engineering challenges, things that are important, making a difference on the things we look at. And that's one thing that's gotten us into the energy field as well as microelectronics. So I think the balance of basically being motivated by the end use, but really trying to contribute to the fundamentals, is something that served my research group well and myself well over the years. So I have a group that is comprised of not just engineers, but I have scientists in the group, and we all work together on kind of an intermix of problems. And one thing I've learned very early on, because I moved from a science department to an engineering department, is I had this preconceived notion that the engineers would want to work on the applied problems, the engineering students and the scientists on the more fundamental problems. And that is completely not the case. So, I mean, everybody's individual, but somebody's degree program doesn't mean that they're going to only want to work on applied things. I've had engineers do some of the most fundamental surface chemistry experiments in my group, and some of the scientists, getting their PhD, say, in physics, work on some of the most applied projects.
That's great. Yeah, I can relate to that, because I think my background was chemistry background, and the thing I liked doing the most in Steve's lab was designing and building the reactors. So more like a mechanical engineering type of work in any case. So yeah, that's super great. And I think having, or being at the nexus of all that, and having all the diverse backgrounds, maybe kind of breeds the opportunities for people to have them in any case. If they're stuck in a place where you can only do fundamentals or only do applied things, then yeah, you may not even know if that was what you really like to do in the first place.
Right. And like you said, I think that bringing together the interdisciplinary mix of backgrounds really helps drive projects forward. And it just makes it a lot more fun, because people bring different perspectives and they have different areas of expertise.
Was this something that you were always motivated by, even from like a young age, when you were first starting science, that you liked fundamental and you liked applied things, or did that kind of evolve over time as you started to do research and move to different institutions?
Yeah, it probably evolved just as I got experience. When I was, younger, I didn't know the first thing about research. I wouldn't have known to say I liked, more applied or fundamental. But as I was involved in it over the years, and I've gone back and forth between science and engineering departments, I've sort of seen the benefit of both sides. And I think my philosophy is that once you dive deeply into anything, it can become interesting, right? So if I were plopped into a completely different field, I would be talking to you about that right now. That would have been extremely interesting to me. But I have this kind of inherent love of just fundamental chemistry questions. So that's kind of where I tend to fall if left to myself. Again, motivated by things that will really make a difference.
And you're in the chemical engineering department, or that's your original appointment at Stanford.
That's my main department. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you have, what is it, an honorary sort of type of appointment in chemistry as well?
Yeah, we have what are called courtesy appointments at Stanford University. So that means you're affiliated with the university. I mean, with that department, but you're not a regular. That's not your home department. So yes, I have courtesy appointments in chemistry, material science and engineering, and also electrical engineering. So because my research and the students I work with come from those different fields. I also, as of the fall, have a half of my appointment, not a courtesy, a regular appointment, is in a new school at Stanford University. We have a new school for sustainability. So in that school, I'm in the new Department of Energy Science and Engineering.
Wow, that's awesome. I feel like I'm seeing these programs pop up quite a bit in some places. Just down the road here from Helsinki is Aalto University, and I've done a couple like job fairs for recruitment there, and many of them are from like the sustainability program. Like, man, I wish that was something that I had the opportunity to be part of. But that's a really good segue, actually. Good that you mentioned it into the other half of your lab, the applied half, and the energy projects that you're working on. And I remember I don't know if you are still the director of the Tomcat Sustainability Center, or if that was a former position, but you were at one point the director.
Yeah, right. I am no longer, but I was the director of the Tomcat Center for Sustainable Energy for 10 years. So the inaugural director of that, and we started all kinds of, I think, really important programs for sustainability at Stanford University. Things about we have an innovation transfer program, which is a way of getting ideas out from the lab, into the real world. So really an early startup type of program. We have graduate and postdoctoral fellowship programs and summer internships for undergraduates. So I was deeply involved in that for a long time. I also was the co-director for 5 or 6 years of a Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy Frontier Research Center, where we looked at nanostructured materials for energy conversion devices. So I have been involved in sustainable energy pursuits, both in my research program and also just kind of leadership and management for a number of years now.
Was that a passion for a while, or did something you fell into when you got into Stanford?
It's sort of evolved over time, as I think it has for many of us here on Earth, as we see, pending crisis of really trying to understand climate change and all of our energy use, both in the U.S. and worldwide. So it's one of those things, if I think my background would be helpful in solving that problem, then, I want to try to apply it. The other driver to moving in these directions is that the students are really passionate about it, and students come to me and say, I really like, these kind of techniques, thinking about surfaces, but I really want to apply it to, application A. What do you think about that? So sometimes students are the drivers to get into new areas. And it's just evolved over time. My involvement in it, we started small. It was actually very early days of doing atomic layer deposition. We were really, again, doing selective deposition, as I mentioned. That's how we got into the field. And I have a colleague, Fritz Prince, who at the time worked on solid oxide fuel cells and also did ALD. And, we teamed up together to look at applying ALD and selective ALD to solid oxide fuel cells. So that was my first foray into, energy conversion devices. And since then, we've done work on, solar cells, not just the fuel cells. We work on batteries now, catalysts, electrocatalysts. So we've done a lot of different energy applications. Again, finding places where we think our unique, or at least somewhat unique skill set can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And I know that your lab works a lot with, as you mentioned, the batteries and the catalysts, which I think are really, really nice examples of applications for ALD, because everything is happening at interfaces or surfaces or something something like this. I spoke with Airline Dameron from Forge Nano. If people have listened to that episode, they're a company, ALD company, primarily focused on batteries, but many others as well. But she was saying about batteries that you find one interface where you can apply ALD, and then you find 10 more, and it seems like there's an infinite amount. But I was hoping that you could potentially speak on the importance of kind of doing this interfacial engineering, surface engineering for these types of applications.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, that's exactly how I think about it, whether it turns out ALD is the way to do interface engineering or some other method. I really feel that many of these devices and applications are dominated by interfacial issues and problems, right? So, and that's one reason I sort of laugh a little bit when I say we worked. I could go through the whole list of different types of materials. And just in the solar cell field, we worked on so many different types of solar cells, because every one of those is basically a stack of different elements, and every one, or materials, and every part of a stack has an interface that in some way impacts the performance of that device. And so you can pick any of those and say, hey, what if we modified this one and got something better? And there's always really, interesting fundamental questions there. So I think they're dominated by interfaces, and especially so as things get smaller, right? The surface to volume ratio really increases. Catalysts, for example, have always been an interfacial problem, right? At least heterogeneous catalysis and electrocatalysis, those things only take place at, the catalytic activity only occurs at these interfaces. So, that's an old field that, of course, has focused on surfaces and interfaces for a long time. But I think ALD brings new possibilities even to catalysis. In the area of batteries, I mean, so many of the challenges with modern, say, lithium-based batteries or other types of batteries are focused on problems at interfaces, interfacial instability, formation of dendrites of the metal that you're depositing, basically because of what's going on at an interface, that it really opens itself up to trying to do modification. And there has been, wonderful work. We're certainly coming to some of these fields after people have really laid a lot of terrific groundwork on a very small film of something you might put down by ALD, really improving some aspect of, say, battery performance. And one of the things I always joke about with in my own group is that the magic material in ALD always seems to be aluminum oxide. Oh, you have a battery problem. Let's put a little layer of aluminum oxide. Hey, that's the one that works best, It's always aluminum. So solar cells, too, it's aluminum oxide. There's something about that material. Now, of course, we try to go beyond aluminum oxide and look at things that might be better. But, it's always a good starting point.
We got lucky that that's now our ALD model system, is it just seems to work for everything. So, I can't remember who it was. I know that I was reading something from Atomic Limits not that long ago that was mentioning the first TMA water process, and I can't remember who it was. But now we definitely have them to thank with this.
Yeah, you're right. It's also everybody's go-to process when you're trying out a new ALD reactor, and I mean it's a pretty stable, usable process. But it also turns out that the material you grow by it tends to be pretty helpful in a lot of applications.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the battery application, how do you keep up with the rapid pace of development that's happening in the field? It seems like as soon as you figure out, okay, maybe we can use it here, this one interface, now they've come up with 2 or 3 new materials or kind of new way to squish them together, and then it's okay, well, now I have 3, 5, 6 new interfaces to look at this point.
The way I have really approached this, and this has been true, I think, in many of the kind of interdisciplinary or new areas we've gone into in research, is to work with others who are more expert in that application, right? So when we work on batteries, we've basically been collaborating with Each Way, who's a colleague of mine in the material science and engineering department at Stanford, also in energy science and engineering. And, he runs a very experienced group in doing lithium and other batteries. And so all of our work is basically learning from what they know and what they think some of the key problems are, and basically brainstorming where we think our interfacial engineering, but typically by ALD, can make a difference. So I have several students now working on and postdocs working on batteries, and it's basically all in collaboration with that group. So it's a pretty productive way of, I think, getting into new areas. And that was true when we worked on fuel cells. It was with Fritz Brentz, who's an expert in solid oxide fuel cells. When we've worked on solar cells, we've worked with a number of groups, including Mike McGee, who is an expert of perovskite solar cells. So we've really benefited from the knowledge and the generosity of other leaders in their field to basically share their knowledge with us.
This is maybe an interesting question. Well, I hope it's interesting. As you've been, and your group has been doing work on these batteries, and maybe both from any applied standpoint, your engineering interfaces on the catalysts or on the batteries, for example, have you found anything interesting from a fundamental perspective that you learned from doing the kind of applied projects that maybe you hadn't found or would think about differently from when you were actually doing fundamental work? Hopefully that question made sense.
Yeah, you mean, have we sort of fallen into some really interesting fundamental things when we've been looking at applied?
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely, that's true. That's what makes science and research so exciting, is these sort of unexpected discoveries. In the case of, one that comes to mind, I'm sure there are many, but in the case of catalysts, we've been looking at supported metal catalysts. So you have like metal nanoparticles of something. It might be rhodium or cobalt on top of a metal oxide, so SiO2 or aluminum oxide. And we've wanted to do a little bit of surface modification by doing atomic layer deposition. We might put just a few layers down. And much to our glee and surprise, we found that in some of those cases, that ALD was highly selective to either the metal or the metal oxide or the metal oxide in the metal. Of course, we have a whole other program doing a selective ALD. Mm-hmm. So we're very interested in that. But these are ones that happen inherently in the catalysis system. And so from that, we've been really trying to understand why these particular growth systems have, say, an intrinsic reactivity for a metal over a metal oxide. Some of them were kind of unexpected selectivities. And then that's led to us, and this is still work in progress, going away from these more, a little bit harder to characterize nanoparticle systems that we have in catalysis, and trying to do planar surfaces to understand the selectivity question. So that's just one example, but it happens all the time. And those are the kind of things you hope for.
I'm sure having this type of lab, again, I'll go back to the fundamentals and applied mix, that, these are constantly kind of feeding into each other, which again makes for very efficient science, I can imagine, and no lack of ideas for new projects, that's for sure. Right. But again, I want to give a shout out to my students and postdocs, because they are the ones who are, I've been so privileged to work with a brilliant group of researchers over the years, and they get the joys and the challenges of doing this research, and they have, many of these discoveries, and they play just a huge part in all of this. We can give shout outs to two friends of the podcast as well, then one to David Bergsman, former graduate student, and one to Boram Lee, former postdoc as well. Yeah. So we're starting to get the Stacey Bent ecosystem on the show as well. Yeah, something I've definitely picked up on just in this 35 minutes we've been talking is that you have a knack for really listening to your students and hearing their suggestions, allowing them to pull threads that they'd like to, or pursue opportunities in maybe a space that wasn't the box that they originally sat in. And I imagine that extra freedom kind of helps the research process as well, and the synergy of the group.
Right, I think so. Every student is so different in how much independence they want at whatever stage of their graduate studies or postdoctoral training. So it really varies a lot by student. I think a lot of students definitely are looking for a little bit more direction at the beginning, and then they go off and they come back and say, hey, guess what? This is more interesting. And other ones just come in right away and say, I know your group doesn't work on area A, but I want to start working on it, which I always find is really fascinating. And I say to them, over the years, I've learned I don't want to go too far afield, because then that drives us into so many different directions where we might become too diffuse and not have the impact we want. But I always, have to tell a student or a postdoc like that, it will be an additional challenge to do something like that, because you will have to rely on other people as well as me to get what you want there. And so, one example of that is our battery work. I have a phenomenal student who's just graduating now, Solomon Oyakuri, and he basically did that. I want to work on batteries. I know you really don't work on it, but I'm going to make it happen. So he started this collaboration between my group and Each Way. So in some cases, it is very much, driven from the beginning by students, but more commonly, it's, as with all of us, you go in an area and the more you learn about it, you say, hey, I could use this over here in this adjacent field, or hey, what if I did this? And I love to see that evolution in the students and postdocs that I work with.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. I didn't know that this was a student-driven project, some of this battery stuff. That's very cool. So speaking of you not being in the lab so much anymore, I would like to ask a little bit about your current title at Stanford, which I have this right here, the Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Postdoctoral Affairs. And I would love to know how you ended up coming into this position, if there was motivation kind of leading up in the years to be in a spot like this, and what does this position mean for you right now?
Yeah. So, right. I've been doing this for not quite 4 years, this vice provost role, and it's been really an interesting and challenging experience all around. What got me interested in it was really, again, sort of an evolution over time of doing more kind of management and administrative roles in addition to my research and teaching. So I mentioned directing, as you did, the Tomcat Center for Sustainable Energy. I directed that Energy Frontier Research Center, and then also was chair of my department, and I was a senior associate dean in my School of Engineering. So I had been doing some of these positions, which gave me kind of a different challenge in my role, in my job. And I enjoyed it. So you see much more of the university. You get to work with different people, and you get to have impacts in different ways. I like to think we work to have impact in our scientific research, but when I take on these administrative roles at the university, I have impact for sometimes people and policies and processes that can long outlive me and my time at Stanford. So the reason I became interested in this Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Postdoctoral Affairs work is, well, you've heard in what we've talked about so far, I spend a lot of my time working with and enjoying working with graduate students and postdocs. But I also had been involved in a few different commissions on graduate education, one for the American Chemical Society and one at Stanford University, where we really thought through, how do we handle graduate education in the U.S. or at Stanford, and what could we do differently? So when the opportunity came to take this role, I was interested in seeing what we could do, if I could make some changes that would be beneficial in graduate education. And it has, in some cases, I've been able to do that. We put in place, new funding mechanisms, new fellowships. We've really helped in some areas that I think have been important. And then we've also, I've been in this role at a time of great turmoil globally. We had the pandemic, for example. And so there were certainly aspects of the position that were unexpected and huge challenges that I don't think any of us predicted. But the good thing in all of that was really just working with the leadership team at the university. So I have enjoyed it. It's been quite an interesting position.
That's so nice. It seems like it's I imagine being a PI is a well-suited stepping stone, at least for having some base level understanding of the struggles coming from, I mean, the same background yourself. You were a graduate student, a postdoc, you're yourself at some point. So having those shared experiences and the ability to sympathize with what graduate students and postdocs kind of go through and live through at this time, sure, is wildly helpful. Is there a particular step that you've made in this position over the past 4 years that you feel really proud of?
Well, I think several that I've already mentioned, but one that I'm excited about is we've started a new fellowship program that allows students to do, doctoral students to spend some of their time while they're getting their PhD kind of away from campus doing public service or social impact work. I think there's so many students who have these interests, but you know what it's like. You've been a doctoral student yourself. You get very focused on your dissertation work, and you don't take, step away and take time to think there's another thing. Maybe I could use my knowledge and go work in in government for a quarter and really see what that's like, and maybe make some contribution, or work for a nonprofit using my skill set, say in building ALD equipment, although that might be a rare example. So I'm pretty excited about that. We're piloting this fellowship program. We have phenomenal graduate students who are taking part in it, and they're starting to put together what their projects are going to be, during this kind of externship period. So that's one that, was something that I wanted to do when I first took the position, and we're seeing it come to fruition has been very satisfying.
I really, really love to hear that, actually. I mean, this conversation that we're having right now is entirely because I don't work in a lab anymore. I do marketing, but I certainly during my time in grad school was very interested in other things outside of traditional science and things like this. And I really have to hand it to Steve for allowing me and indulging me in some of these other interests that I had, and allowing me to pursue some of these other opportunities and learn a bit about things, and which ultimately landed me in a position that I feel much happier in than I would have been if I went down a more traditional research path at the end of the day. And whether that's, doing something more corporate, like doing marketing, or as you mentioned, being in government or media, or just nonprofits in general. Yeah, it's very difficult to, one, even find any information about how to get into these types of positions, and two, even more difficult to find the time to do them in any case. So yeah, I really, that makes me really happy to hear that you're, affording some deliberate opportunities and spaces for students to pursue these things.
Yeah, it really, it gives them the space, the time, the training. There's a kind of a course that goes along with it, and also legitimizes those interests, because there's a fellowship program that basically it was a very competitive to win this. So the university is saying, we want you to spend some time doing these other interests that you have.
That's really wonderful. And is this across all disciplines, not just STEM majors, for instance?
Right. All disciplines, yeah.
That's great. And so now that you're in this position, of course, you still are managing the lab. Do you find some kind of synergy, like working between the two? Does it kind of have a feedback loop back into each other?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm still very much, I'm running a relatively large research group. I've just finished teaching this quarter. It completely informs what I do in the Vice Provost role. I think that the two positions very much inform each other. So I don't think I could be nearly as successful a Vice Provost if I didn't also run a research group and teach, because I get to see all the time, what real issues. I'm very familiar with, what it is like to be a graduate student and postdoc and work at the university in research and take classes. And at the same time, what I've learned and what I see as Vice Provost gives me new insight into students and postdocs that I then, I think, find helpful when I work with them in the classroom and in the lab.
Does your lab group take pride in that their PI is the Vice Provost?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
Yeah, they should. I'll track some down in Bellevue next month.
Yeah, that's right.
If I can get a lot of them. Well, Stacey, this has been really great. Every time I do these, I think the time flies by so fast. I look down, I'm like, okay, we're already approaching close to the end. I just want to ask one last thing that I like to ask a lot of people at the end here, and it's just if you have any wisdom, philosophy, advice for people that are entering ALD, or maybe people who have been in ALD for a while, something that you would like to impart on them for the end of the episode.
Ooh, I should have prepared for that one. That would have been good to think about. But what I would say in general, and whatever the area is, but here we're just talking about ALD, is do what you find interesting. You have to find it exciting and interesting. But as I mentioned earlier in this episode, I think when you get deeply into most things, you find it interesting. Everything's really interesting at some level. So as long as you could pick anything, try to also pick things that others will care about, right? So I might find this topic really interesting, but will it have an impact that others will care? So to balance both of those things as you go forward and pick areas of research within the ALD field.
Fantastic. Hopefully everybody listened very closely to what you just said. Well, Stacey, I think that we have really covered a lot of really interesting topics today, a lot about your background and your work at Stanford. And this has been a really, really wonderful conversation. So I have to thank you so much again for taking time out of the very busy schedule that you have to indulge me and indulge people listening to the podcast. Thank you really once again for joining us.
Thank you, Tyler. It's really been my pleasure. And thank you for inviting me to the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to ALD Stories with Benek. To stay updated on new episodes each month, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. We hope you enjoyed the show. I hope to see you again in the next one.